So we all know that racial minority groups have been a part of North America's growth and development since its inception. And as more and more people from these diverse communities graduate and become involved in the workforce, there is an ever more growing need to have conversations about diversity and inclusion on the job. Joining us now to discuss these corporate dynamics is Edward Sylvan, CEO of Sycamore Entertainment Group Incorporated. So first of all, sir, how can corporations best serve the needs and foster corporate goodwill at the same time?
Jimmy, thanks for having me. Jimmy, how that works is how to serve the needs of diversity and inclusion. It really comes to understanding. That's the number one thing. Ask the right questions. Allow these diverse groups to speak their authentic voice within corporate culture so that they can share their experiences with their fellow employees. That way, they can incorporate some of those ideologies, some of those behaviors, some of those thought patterns into actually developing true corporate culture.
Mm-hmm. Because as you said, in all thy getting, get an understanding. That is the most important thing, especially when we're talking about people and everyone has layers. Now, what specifics can brands do to speak to the diverse audiences that support them?
First, they have to understand what diversity means. That's number one, because most people think diversity is about black and white, and it's not about that at all. I can be in a room full of black people and they're all conservatives. Is that and even white people or Indian people, and they're all conservatives or they're all Christians. That's
right,
not a diverse.
That part right there.
That's right. So that's not a diverse group. You have to have diversity in terms of color, religion, sexuality, ideologies. That's a diverse group. So first comes the understanding. And once they have the understanding of that, corporations have to put those different diverse ideologies into positions of power in terms of decision-making processes, hiring, and all of those things that allow them to be able to pull from their various experiences to build a corporation that is truly diverse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, we all know that whenever we start a new job, the first few things that we're trying to feel out is, what is the culture of this workplace environment? So how can corporate cultures sort of enhance, amend, adjust their workflow to provide for more diversity and inclusion?
One of the things they have to do there, Jimmy, is they have to allow them to feel that they're part of something. Actually, let them speak their authentic voices, what I just said. Make them feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. Sometimes when you go to work environments, everybody who you can tell the different cultures by who they eat lunch with, by who they socialize with. So those corporations aren't diverse because they're not allowing for mixture and flow of the true different cultures. So they have to implement policies that allow them to be able to interact with each other, learn, break up those groups, have them speak to each other, and just learn about each other. Go to lunch together, go to lunch with somebody else policies so that they can sit down and talk break bread over a lunch and learn about each other, and then take that back to the workplace. That's the implementation that has to happen in order for true inclusion and diversity to happen in a workplace.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying create an atmosphere where the job is going to get done, but I care more about the person that is sitting next to me doing that job. Okay, right. Gotcha. Definitely hone in on the person.
Correct. Gotcha. Absolutely.
All right, so how easy or difficult is diversity and inclusion to understand and apply within corporate cultures, but without federally mandated policies?
Again, Jimmy, it's easy. It's very easy once you understand what true diversity is. And once you have that understanding, there can be policies put in place that bring people together. I think most people just have the wrong impression of what diversity is. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to understanding and asking the right questions. And I think with what's happened in the last few years and even few months with respect to the different separation of individuals and the different separations of cultures mm-hmm. and races, I think we've lost track and sight of what true diversity means. And I think that if we go back to the basic understanding of who we are as people, I think that, and ask the right questions, I think that can come out and move this conversation forward.
Mm-hmm. Right, because no matter what our job description is or how high or low we are in a company, we're still all people at the same time. And, as soon as we understand people, it's so much easier to function. So where can folks go for more information about you and Sycamore Entertainment Group, sir?
Thanks for asking, Jimmy. You can go to SEGI.TV, SEGI.TV. That's our brand new streaming platform where you can watch television shows and movies. We're also available on Roku as well as Amazon, Fire Stick TV, or you can go to sycamoreentertainment.com to read about what we're doing.
Again, thank you so very much for having this conversation with us, sir. As you said, the last year, we have really all been pointed at the golden rule, what it used to be. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's what a lot I hear you saying is truly get that understanding. So thank you so very much for your time. Edward Sylvan, CEO of Sycamore Entertainment Group. Of course, folks, you can find all this information on firstcoastliving.net. Thanks again, sir.
Thank you, Jimmy.